Is life so dear, or so peace, or so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty, or give me death. Your very famous line from Patrick Henry, given a year before the 13 colonies actually declare their independence. And so we're going to talk about with these notes the actual road to America actually declaring its independence, and whether or not it was absolutely inevitable or if it could have possibly been prevented. So we're going to start pre-French and Indian War with some of your key events. You have the Navigation Acts, which is where, you remember, British mercantilism, British control over colonial trade, and these were laws that pretty much re-emphasized that America can only trade with the British. Its effect there is America begins smuggling to avoid this, and it's your first opposition to British rule. 1733, you have the Molasses Act, which is your first tax on anything. This was specifically on molasses, sugar, and rum imported, and it was imported from essentially it was a tax on anything not British. So it's your first control of colonial trade, and again, colonies react by smuggling. The secret ingredient is thievery. The Great Awakening was a religious movement in the Americas, but why it was significant in relation to the Revolution is that you have your colonists calling themselves American rather than British citizens. There's a lot else that the Great Awakening did, but in terms of American identity, it was very, very significant. Then the French and Indian War. Now, we already talked about this in class. The biggest effect was 13 colonies are very empowered, and it puts Britain deep, deep into debt. This right here is arguably more significant in the long-term causes of the revolution than possibly anything else. During this war, you had the Albany Congress, Albany Plan of Union, an attempt to unite the 13 colonies. As you know, it failed. The 13 colonies, they wanted to maintain their own power. They had been running themselves as 13 individual separate British colonies up to this point, so they weren't about ready to give up that power. But the idea of 13 colonies working together was finally on the table, and that was significant. So even though this join or die mentality failed, for the first time, the idea is out there that they would work together. French and Indian War ends. France is kicked completely out of North America. England gets Florida and Canada. Unfortunately, the colonies and the Indians continue to fight, and that's Pontiac's Rebellion. The effects of Pontiac's Rebellion, though, was the British at this point are already egregiously in debt from fighting the French. They don't want to have to afford additional funds to keep fighting the Native Americans. So you have the Proclamation of 1763. King draws a line down the Appalachian Mountains and just says, do not pass this line. You are on your own if you do that. And this makes the colonists absolutely furious. Those who fought in the French and Indian War felt like this was land that they had rightfully fought for, that they are now being told you can't settle it. So then back to the issue of debt. So the point of the proclamation was to try to save money of protecting the colonies, but now there's the issue of actually paying for the French and Indian War, and so now you have a series of taxes that are about to happen. So first you have the Sugar Act in 1764. This was a British tax on, you guessed it, sugar, and this was to pay directly for the French and Indian War. This absolutely disrupted local economies in the colonies. There were a lot of colonial businesses that were making fringe profits that this put them into the red, and the colonial reaction is to begin to boycott British goods. And so this is your first of many headbutts that happen over British taxes. And so it's your first instance of taking out the frustration on the actual tax collectors, even though, again, it it wasn't them that actually created the taxes, it was just their job to collect the taxes. The famous tar and feathering of tax collectors, which I assure you, even though it kind of looks funny of haha, he looks like a chicken, this was a horrific thing to endure. So then you have the following year, the Stamp Act of 1765. This was a direct tax on things the colonists used. Anything paper, newspapers, import-export licenses, playing cards, etc. And the reason why this one was significant was this was a direct tax where the money went right to the English crown as opposed to local government. The Sugar Act was more just a way to make the colonies not as expensive for the British. This was a direct bill that went right to the crown. And once again, the colonists reacted with boycotting items in protests. They forced officials to resign, and the Sons of Liberty is finally formed. And this mentality of no taxation without representation. Understand, it's not the tax that the colonists hated. It's that the tax was passed by British Parliament. It was voted on by representatives in the English crown. Of those representatives, none of them were colonial. So this is a tax on the colonies that the colonies did not get to vote for. Benjamin Franklin famously said, "Nothing is so certain as death and taxes." The taxes themselves, they really weren't that bad. They weren't even that high. It's that these are taxes being passed without any input from the colonies. If the colonies had representatives in in Parliament, they probably would have said, yeah, these are fair. These are actually, all things considered, pretty low taxes. But it's the fact that these were imposed without an ounce of colonial input is why there was such egregious reaction. So the same year, you also have the Quartering Act of 1765, which isn't necessarily a tax, but it's a way for the British to save money. And so to lower the cost of having troops in the colonies, the Parliament issues a law that colonists are required to house and feed and provide for British troops for their protection. And the effect is it creates a disdain between the colonies and the troops, and the colonists absolutely despise it. It feels like forced occupation. It feels like they're being forced to take care of troops who are there to keep them in line. And the colonists, it feels like almost like a martial law. Same year, Sons of Liberty is formed, and these are groups of disgruntled colonial gangs to protest British policies. Some of them just organize boycotts, where other Sons of Liberty actually create acts of violence, attacking British tax collector, attacking British colonial officials. And so now you're having actual violence between the colonies and the British with the Sons of Liberty. And that's also that year is you have actual colonial collaboration where the colonial leadership meet to discuss the reaction to the Stamp Act, and they issue a colonial-wide boycott of British taxed goods, and this causes massive profit loss on the British part. Now the British are actually losing even more money than when they passed the taxes because of this boycott and agreed stopping of British goods. And the colonies are working together, so it's actually even more unity than the Albany Plan of Union. So the next year, the King and Parliament repeal the Stamp Act because they're losing so much money, but they issue the Declaratory Act of, look, we're getting rid of this tax, but we have the right to tax you at any point. So it solves the Stamp Act issue, but the issue of taxes being passed without colonial representation isn't fixed at all. So the British are addressing the short-term issue, not addressing the major issue that truly infuriated the colonists. Because then the very next year, they passed the Townshend Revenue Acts, which is pretty much the Stamp Act with the inclusion of tea. So it didn't fix the problem at all. It was just a different name. And again, colonists call for boycotts, and issues not solved in the slightest. Then in 1770, you have the Boston Massacre. I put quotes around the word massacre because that's what it gets called. We're going to talk more about this in class. What you need to know is that the actual conflict itself, British soldiers opened fire on a colonist crowd, and it didn't, whether or not the soldiers did it in self-defense or it was an act of egregious murder, you still had British soldiers shooting mostly unarmed, I do mostly with air quotes, colonial civilians. This was bad. And it didn't help that the patriotic anti-British colonials took this and they started calling it the massacre. They called it the Boston Massacre. They made it look like it was a unprovoked shooting of colonists. 1773, you have the Tea Act, which was actually, in terms of dollar-wise, a really good deal for the colonists, where all the taxes were removed except for tea. But again, it wasn't about the money, it was about the representation. And so again, the colonists still opposed it. They actually were saving money with the Tea Act, but it was an unprovoked taxation. So that's when you have the Boston Tea Party, where there's 300 casks of Boston tea that's dumped into the harbor. Other colonies will follow suit, and it leads to the Intolerable Acts, which is probably, of all the causes, the Intolerable Acts is probably the biggest thing. It's actually, the official term was the Coercive Act. That's probably the biggest thing that leads to the revolution. And so the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts as the colonists called it, you can get a sense for how they felt about it, was Parliament demanded you can't just destroy an entire ship's worth of tea and not have consequences. Pretty much the city of Boston was put under martial law. The port of Boston was put under, was closed and put under British control until the tea was paid back. And this was the aggressive act by the British, which again, you can understand why they did it. This was the act that was the line in the sand. Either you support independence or you support the British. They've taken action against us. Mind you, it was a reaction to something the colonists had done. So you have the First Continental Congress, where you have the first talks of breaking away. It's not happening yet, but it's being talked about. And then you have actual fighting. You have the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It was the colonists were trying to assemble weapons, and they were for the potential fighting that might happen. So the British troops were going to confiscate those weapons, and you have actual fighting at Lexington and Concord and all the way back. For the British, it was actually kind of a disaster. The colonists were able to get the weapons out of Concord before they got there. Yes, they won the Battle of Lexington. They were able to rout the soldiers at Concord, but all the way back, British soldiers are being peppered on the way back. Then you have Thomas Paine, who wrote the book Common Sense, where it's one of those books that changes history. He outlined in his book why. Why are we staying with the British? This isn't helping us in the slightest. And he argued that this relationship isn't helping us. We are better off without them. So the Second Continental Congress, which they essentially do two things. On one side, they try to fix things with the Olive Branch petition of, please, this has gotten out of control, let's try to fix this. But they realize that's probably not going to happen. So they also start planning the logistics for war, leadership, money, supplies. And in June of 1776, they agree to begin voting for independence. And so that's in April of 1776 is when the colonies start voting for an agreement on independence. And so July of 1776 is when the actual ratification and agreement of the Declaration of Independence is actually signed, which, understand, the Declaration was not just a statement that we're declaring independence. It was a well-written essay of here's the reason why we're breaking away, to justify it not just to England, not just to other nations who they're going to try to get support from, but also to the Americans as well, because there's a lot of Americans who are still iffy on if it's going to happen.